All right, so you can open your Bible this evening to Genesis chapter 47, and we'll be using the visual outline chart that you've got in front of you to walk our way through the portion that we're studying this evening. I'll use the screen to zoom in on things, and you can ignore it or follow that, whichever is useful for you. This morning, we were studying more closely the end of chapter 47, Jacob's burial plans, his burial wishes, that he not be left in Egypt. He wanted to make sure that he got out of Egypt and that Egypt was not left in the heart of his family. So this evening, we're going to be looking at the passages around that, earlier in chapter 47 and then on in chapter 48. This is a section that we're reading tonight that has lots of gains and losses. Many people losing their fortunes, some people gaining fortunes. And then there is a talk of inheritance as Jacob is going to begin to bless his sons. And the first son he'll bless is his son Joseph. But he'll bless him through his sons in an unexpected way. Lots of twists and turns. You know, when it comes to wills and estates and testaments and all that, sometimes it goes according to plan, and other times you get there for the reading of the will, and boy, there's some strange things. You find out that brother X has been X'd out of the will, or sometimes he receives a debt instead of something positive. There are some twists and turns in the passage we'll look at today, but it's all going to be good by the time it's done. We have been lately for quite a while in this 10th section of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis breaks up into 10 major sections. And the last section, as you see circled there in yellow at the top, is from chapter 37 to the end of the book. It focuses on Jacob and his family and all of the saga that goes along with him as the last patriarch. And lately, we've been studying chapters 42 to 47, where Joseph, we see, has been raised up to deliver his family. And most recently, chapters 46 to 47, the whole family has been reunited with Joseph. Last week, we looked at chapters 46 and the beginning of chapter 47, where they made that migration from Canaan to Goshen, where the Lord assured Jacob that even though they were all leaving the promised land, God was not leaving his promise, that this was for a time. This was for, as I said this morning, for the incubation of the nation, so that they could grow in a way that they could not otherwise. So after learning how they're going to be cared for in Goshen, we come to the portion we'll start reading tonight in chapter 47, verses 13 to 27. And verses 13 to 26 of this chapter focus on how Joseph was a trusted administrator. He was able to keep everything from falling apart during those 7 years of incredibly tense famine. He kept things going for the nation. He kept people from dying. And at the same time, it resulted in Pharaoh's coffers and Pharaoh's strength growing quite a bit. What we're going to read in a moment is going to sound like a continuation of when Joseph began to come to power. All the way back in chapter 41, at the end of chapter 41, Joseph has been raised up in power, and we're told how he is stored the grain, and he's selling the grain, and he's helping the nation go. And then we have 5-6 chapters of interruption where his brothers show up, and all the saga with his brothers, and eventually leading to the reunion. And now the story comes back to Joseph and his administrative power. And first, the text is going to focus on Egypt's survival and Pharaoh's growing advantage. Note with me in verses 13 to 14 the liquidation of money to buy grain. This is what the Egyptians get reduced to with this severe famine. Verse 13 of chapter 47 says, "Now there was no food in all the land, because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land and Canaan languished because of the famine." They languished. The Hebrew word is drooping. I mean, it's just like falling over. There's no strength. Verse 14 continues that Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So he's had a masterful plan of how to keep everything afloat, and the result of it is people are spending lots and lots of money, and it's going into the imperial coffers. There's not a thing wrong with that. There's not a sense that the people are being taken advantage of. But it happens that, someone is going to gain wealth out of this, and that's going to be Pharaoh. The thing that it was, the story right before this, I should have mentioned it a moment ago, the thing that happened just a few verses before was Jacob, the 130-year-old man, walks in with his cane before Pharaoh and blesses Pharaoh. That might be as simple as niceties and wishing him well, but here's the patriarch that God has chosen pronounces a blessing on the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh is being blessed. We come to verses 15 to 17, and we find out that people are running out of money. Verse 15, when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone. Then Joseph said, give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he put them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So there's no more money, so now they bartering with livestock of every kind. And the kind of arrangement might be that sometimes it might be that they actually give away the livestock they have or a portion of their livestock, or they might give over ownership of their livestock and then continue to operate the agro-business, but now no longer as owners, but as tenants. But this keeps people going through. This is like the Great Depression on steroids. It's just a really very difficult time. And then we come to verses 18 to 22 when we find out that this is going to run its course as well. We come to verse 18. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed, that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, which they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. So now things are so desperate, they're willing to exchange their property. And not only their property, not only their land, but even themselves. They're willing to become what we would now call, in legal terms, indentured servants. Slavery is a hard thing for us to get our hands around. Our culture, we fought a war over slavery. It really looms large over our minds. But you've got to know that slavery in antiquity was often not like what the American experience was. American slavery, as well as European slavery, was often based upon race. It was often relegated the slave to being like cattle. They were traded like animals. But in ancient days, most forms of slavery were not like that. Most forms of slavery were what we would call indentured servitude, where there was the opportunity for a person to work their way out of the position. It was actually one of the ways that in ancient times people dealt with issues of poverty and misfortune. If you were a slave and you had a slave owner who took his responsibilities seriously, you knew you would be cared for. So if the people put themselves under Pharaoh in a position of servitude, they know that Pharaoh will care for them. They will work, yes, and in a sense they will not be their own, but they will be cared for in ways that they could not otherwise. And that's why the Bible sometimes will use the language of slavery in positive ways. The Apostle Paul will speak of himself as a slave of Jesus Christ. Servant, it's often translated. But it's the word slave, because slavery did not always have the negative connotation that we associate with it. Now let me say that I'm very glad that in the American experience, the kind of slavery we had is completely gone. That was a disgrace. And the fact that Christian people engaged in it was equally disgraceful. But we still have at least one kind of indentured servitude. And we have 5 military branches in which you can get involved in it. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the Coast Guard. When you sign up, you are not your own. You cannot do as you want. You have freedoms and you have rights. Yeah, sort of. You basically become an indentured servant when you join the military. So that's not exactly the same as what ancient indentured servitude. It's not exactly as this scenario, but it's closer than what the American experience of the enslavement of African Americans was like. And as we come to the end of this passage, we'll find out that the people are grateful that this is an opportunity to stay alive a way that they could not. And there's still opportunity down the road for them to work their way out of this for the paying off of debts. Now, there's a mention in verse 22 about the priests being exempt. We're talking about the Egyptian pagan priest here. Perhaps there was some way in which mentioning this helps explain why the Israelites are not going through all of this. You may remember that Joseph married the daughter of a high priest within Egypt. Is it possible that the exemption that her family enjoyed somehow spilled over to the Israelites who were there in Goshen, right next to the city of On, where he was from? It's possible. I think even more importantly that there's a sort of a contrast played up, because in Egypt, the priests owned land and no one could take it from them. That's going to contrast very sharply with what the Lord is going to set up within the nation of Israel. In the nation of Israel, the priests are going to come from the tribe of Levi. And the Levites will have no land. They're the only tribe who will not have land. They will be supplied for by the Lord, and the nation, through the system of tithes and taxes, will care for them in unique ways. I think one of the reasons that Moses, the author of the text, mentions this here is to sort of set up the contrast that when Israel establishes its priesthood, it's going to operate on different grounds than what we see in this spot. So there is land sales and indentured servitude to get grain. And then, in addition to that, there is a 20% tax that becomes levied on this indentured land. We see about this in verse 23. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now, here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh. And 4/5 shall be your own for the seed of the field and for your food and for those of your households and as food for your little ones." So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. A fifth, 20% tax. Now, some of you are in a tax bracket where you kind of wish you had 20% tax. Some of you, you're thankful you're not paying that much. But in ancient days, 20% really wasn't that bad. There were kingdoms that were extremely exploitive, 50, 40, 50, 60, more percent they would take from people. So the arrangement is now, let's say you're a farmer, you've run out of money, you run out of cattle to trade, anything to trade, you've traded in your land, you still live on your land, most likely, and you work that land, but you're as a tenant farmer now, and 20% of what you produce, the sales of that, goes away in tax, then you have the remaining 80%. This is a better scenario than the way things were going. One of the things we're told, by the way, in verse 21 is that there was also a moving around of people. There was a redistribution of people. Verse 21, as for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. So folks who had signed up to be in Pharaoh's service, and so there was a migration of sorts as people were put to work in various projects that bettered the kingdom as well as gave them the sustenance that they needed. All of this is illustrating more of the wisdom of Joseph. These are extremely hard times. These might not be the kinds of choices that you wish you had to deal with, but it's better than dying. And God used Joseph to save the nation and also to save his own people. So most of these verses have been about Egypt's getting along through this time, but there's one more verse in this section. We looked at it this morning. Verse 27 actually belongs to this long paragraph. Not only does Joseph administrate the affairs of Egypt, but also there's one more statement about how Israel was doing differently during this time. Israel, living in the land of Goshen, is enjoying a unique kind of prosperity. Look at verse 27 with me. Now, Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and were fruitful and became very numerous. True to the promise that God had made to Jacob earlier, you go down to Egypt, I will make you a great nation there. Even though the great nation of Egypt is languishing and withering and people are selling their land, Israelites are in an area of exemption. They're in Goshen. They're directly under Joseph's administration. They're the only people in the land who are buying stuff. And the rest of the land is trying to get food, trying to get seed, and they're fruitful. They're having children, their families are growing, and they have all that they need. And this, again, is because of Joseph's unique position that the Lord had placed him in to take this promised people who look so unpromising so often and to begin to grow them into something that they could not do on their own. Well, this morning we looked very closely, one column over, we looked at Jacob's plan for burial in Canaan, verses 28 to 31. And I will not spend a great deal of time on that this evening because I spent so much of it this morning, but we're told about Jacob's extended life in verse 28. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. Can't help but mention again, there's a poetic justice in this. You remember that how old Joseph was when he was separated from his father? Joseph was 17. Joseph had spent 17 years under his father in Canaan, and now Jacob will spend his last 17 years in Egypt under his son's care. It's a beautiful bit of poetic justice. 17 more years than he imagined. He thought he was going to die once he got down there. The Lord enriched him with more life. But he's coming to the end of that era, and he knows he needs to make preparations for death in verses 29 to 31. His advancing age is mentioned in verse 29. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph, and he makes Joseph make a vow to bury him in Canaan. Verse 29b, please, if I found favor in your sight, place your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you've said. He said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. Jacob is concerned that he not be stuck. If his body gets stuck there, maybe they'll all get stuck there. He wants to make sure that his intentions to be part of the land that the Lord has promised, to be part of the promised plan of God, is very visible. And so he makes his son make an oath using a certain ceremony which is obscure to us, but seems to be a ceremony involving deep trust and respect. And the oath is made. And so this ends the discussion about the reunion of Joseph with his family. The whole family now back together under Joseph. And now we move into one of the last sections of the book, a section where there's going to be a lot of blessing. And it's going to start off with Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons. And what we'll find out the next time we're together on a Sunday night is he's going to bless his other sons as well in chapter 49. But here in chapter 48, there's a blessing of Joseph's sons. And this begins by Jacob adopting Joseph's kids, particularly Manasseh and Ephraim. The blessing of Joseph's sons is done for a particular reason. Joseph is what order? There's 12 boys that Jacob has. What number is Joseph? He's way, way down there. He's number 11. Now, I know you cross off one and that makes him one, but that's not the way that works. He's number 11. He is not the one destined, under conventional thinking, to lead all of the family. He's not destined to be a patriarch. But God has ordained him to be the patriarch. God has put him in this place of power, and as the dream he had when he was a boy stated, and now it's come true, that his family is bowing down before him. So what Jacob is going to do is going to solidify Joseph's place back into the family with this blessing, and particularly his sons, because his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, these two boys were not born in the promised land. They were born in Egypt. They were born to a foreign woman, an Egyptian woman who was not part of the clan. And there had been other family members who had married outside the family, and they were cut off. How about Jacob's brother? Who's he? Esau. Married a bunch of Canaanite wives. That's one of the reasons he's cut off. So Jacob is going to take some steps to make sure that no one can make an argument that Joseph and his boys are going to be cut off. Joseph is not an Esau. There's another thing that's going to happen. Who are the number one and the number two boys that Jacob has? Who's the firstborn? The firstborn is Reuben. The secondborn is Simeon. And these guys were scoundrels. I mean scoundrels. Reuben slept with one of Jacob's concubines. Simeon initiated a horrific slaughter at the city of Shechem that it took Jacob a long time to sort out. And even late in his life, he's still bringing that problem up. These two boys cannot be trusted with the leadership of the whole family. So what happens is, not only is Joseph put over them, but Joseph's two boys is put over them. So numbers 1 and 2 become numbers 3 and 4 in the pecking order of things. There's sort of a divine justice that's taking place in all of this. Well, the setting for this adoption is told for us in verses 1 and 2. The setting is Jacob's deathbed and the arrival of Joseph and his sons in those first two verses. Verse 1 says, "Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, 'Behold, your father is sick.' So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. When it was told Jacob, 'Behold, your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed." That's the setting. And now we have a very unusual discussion that unfolds in verses 3 through 7. And I don't think that Joseph foresaw this. He brings his boys to their grandfather, perhaps hoping for some kind of blessing, perhaps hoping that this will be a time of goodness with them. I don't think he anticipates what his father is going to do. Jacob starts talking about terms of adoption, that in a legal sense, he's going to take fatherhood of the boys so that they directly receive portions of his inheritance. And this starts off by Jacob reciting some previous revelation that he has received. Verse 3, "Then Jacob said to Joseph, 'God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession.'" God Almighty at the Hebrew text is El Shaddai, the Almighty One. He appeared to me. And when he mentions Luz, do you know what that is? Luz, that's the old name of Bethel. Remember the first time that Jacob left the land? He was several days' journey away from home, and he's sleeping out in the rough. And God appeared to him and assured him that he was a recipient of the promise. And that even though he was a scoundrel and all, that God was going to, even though he needed to go out of the land, the Lord was going to bring him back, and the Lord would multiply. This man who had no wife, no kids yet, whose brother was trying to kill him, the Lord gave him the promise and the sure word. And that guided Jacob through the rest of his life. God Almighty appeared to me. That was the first time God ever spoke to Jacob. And so now Jacob announces that he is going to, your handout has an incomplete word there. It should say announcement of selective adoption. Announcement of selective adoption, beginning now in verse 5. "Now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers and their inheritance. they will be mine. So notice he mentions his first two born, Reuben and Simeon. So I'm going to take your two boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, and I'm going to put them up here in the pecking order. So when my inheritance is doled out, and it won't be that long before it happens, they get the top two shares. My other two, those two boys of mine, they still get theirs, but down lower in the order. And did you notice, by the way, that Jacob did something here in the middle of verse 5. Your two boys born in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine. Now, I don't know if you noticed that, but right there, Jacob switched their order. Because Joseph had these two boys when he was in Egypt. The firstborn was Manasseh. The secondborn was Ephraim. Jacob, in just listing out their names, switched them. And I don't think Joseph caught on to that. Or if he did, he must have thought, well, Dad's old, and maybe he's a little bit confused sometimes, but he got the names out at least. He didn't forget their names. And so I'm going to take your boys. They're not going to receive a grandchild's inheritance. They're going to receive a son's inheritance. And then he gives a reason why he's doing this in verse 7. Now, as for me, when I came from Padan, that's up in the region of Aram where his relatives were, when I came from Padan, Rachel died, to my sorrow, in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. I don't know if you remember that sad story, but Jacob has come back into the land, and the Lord has appeared to him a number of times, encouraging him that he is with him. He's going to help him with the Esau problem. He's going to help him settle the land. And they start moving south, and his wife gives birth to Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth, well ahead of her age. And it broke his heart. So he doesn't spell it out specifically, but the gist of it is this. My wife should have lived longer. My wife would have had more kids. She didn't, so I'm going to take yours. I'm going to claim yours as mine. They will receive the inheritance they would have, that the ones that I didn't have would have had. Very touching thing. Well, we come now down to verses 8, 9, and 10, and there's the official presentation of the two boys. They've been there, but now they're brought up close to the bed. Verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? You notice how I did that to my voice? Who are these? I don't know if he's talked that way or not, but Joseph said to his father, these are my sons, whom God has given me here. So he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now, the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Jacob's poor vision is mentioned here, and this explains partly why there's repetition. Joseph's here, he's brought his boys, okay, and then, who are these guys? Well, these are my boys. You've been talking about them. But also it's brought up because there's sort of a deja vu here. Do you remember when Jacob stole the blessing from his brother Esau? How did they pull that off? They pulled it off because his father Isaac was practically blind. He couldn't see. He thought he was blessing Esau, pronouncing a prophetic blessing on him, and also officially giving to him the inheritance, and it turns out it was Jacob, the stealer. Well, at first thought, you might think, is something weird going to happen here with that? Jacob's vision isn't very good. But then we have the finalization of the adoption now in verses 11 and 12, and this will go along well. Verse 11, Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well. Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Apparently the boys are kneeling in front of grandfather, and Joseph picks them up and brings them closer. And they all now bow on the ground, I think, in a bow of thanks and gratitude. So that's the adoption. Those boys now, legally speaking, have a new father. Of course, Joseph is going to continue to father them in a parental way. I mean, Jacob is about to die. But in terms of an inheritance, things have changed. And now we come to the blessing of Joseph's family. The legal portion has been sorted out. Now there's a time for a pronouncement. And it's not going to go the way you might think. It starts off with the inverted blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh in verses 13 to 20. The sons are presented for blessing, and Jacob is going to crisscross his hands. Verse 13. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right. In case you're confused by all these directions, they're facing opposite each other, and he positions his oldest boy so that when his father puts out his right hand, the oldest boy will be under that head, and that the youngest boy will be under his father's left hand. That's the way it's supposed to be. The right hand, the favored hand, was symbolic of favor and strength and what have you. And so he positions them in that way. He brought them close to him, verse 14. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands. Although Manasseh was the firstborn, he blessed Joseph. So he has his hands on the boys, but then what he says is to bless Joseph. He's blessing Joseph through his boys. He says, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. And may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. What a profound blessing. What a profound prayer. The God who's been my shepherd all my life to this day. Boy, that's rich. Notice that he speaks about God in verse 15, and then in verse 16 he mentions the angel who has redeemed me. And I think you could capitalize the word angel here, that this is being used as a name of God. Sometimes in the Old Testament there's a phrase that showed up in the stories of Abraham as well, that the angel of the Lord appeared to him. Now, sometimes that means an angel from the Lord. And it's usually clear when that's the case, that, if he's like Michael or Gabriel, he's from the Lord. But there are other times where that seems to mean that this is some kind of appearance of the Lord himself. The phrase would mean the angel which is the Lord. And I think that's what Jacob means here. The one who has brought the message from heaven. He has redeemed me from all of these troubles I've been through. He's brought me through, brought me out. The God who's been with me, who's been with my father, who'd been with my grandfather, may he also be with these boys. And so may the promise go on. That which God began, he will certainly complete. He makes a blessing on them in accordance with the Abrahamic covenant. Beautiful, profound prayer, and Joseph is a little bit irked. Boy, that sure sounded good, but that's just convoluted. What are you doing, Dad? So he protests in verses 17 and 18. Verse 17, when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him, and he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. It displeased him, literally. It was bad in his eyes. Now, the irony is he thought his father had bad eyes. But actually, he's not seeing that the Lord literally has a hand in all of this. That this is intentional. Verse 18, Joseph said to his father, not so, my father. This one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. So notice Jacob now rebuffs this. He makes a prophetic announcement about Ephraim's primacy. Ephraim, the second-born. Verse 19. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. I'm not dumb. I might be blind, but I'm not dumb. I know, my son, I know. He also, Manasseh, your firstborn, he also will become a people. He also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. He blessed them that day, saying, By you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. What a switch. But you know what? This is not the first switch. This is not the first unexpected choice in Genesis. The custom of ancient peoples is that the firstborn receives the lion's share of the inheritance, usually a double share. So, the way it would work normally, if you have 3 boys, the firstborn gets a double percent, and the others get, so you divide it up into 4 parts, right? And the oldest gets half of it, and the others get the remainder. The more sons you have, the more, it gets parceled up a little bit, but that's normally the way things go. But throughout the book of Genesis, we've seen that in God's sovereignty, what people expect to happen is not what often happens. Now, let's go way back before the patriarchs existed. The first 2 boys ever born. Which one turns out to be the Lord's choice? Which one turns out to be the one who pleases the Lord? It's the second-born, Abel. The firstborn's a scoundrel. You see the same kind of thing happen in Noah's generation, where the one you'd expect to be dominant is not dominant. You come into Abraham's life, the firstborn, technically the firstborn he has is who? Technically it's Ishmael, but he was begotten of sinful choices, not God's choice. It's the second one, Isaac, who receives the blessing. Then Isaac, he has 2 boys. Who do we expect should get the blessing? We think it should be Esau, but no, Jacob, twisting, conniving, cheating Jacob, steals it, and yet God in his sovereignty worked through that. It fit the plan of God. Not that Jacob was right, it's not that Jacob was good in what he did, but God worked things together for good. Jacob. And then all of his boys. Oh my, what trouble. The firstborn, Reuben, no. Secondborn, no. The 11th born gets the blessing. And then of his boys, not the firstborn, the second. See, one of the things that God is doing by this happening again and again and again is stressing that I am not obligated to operate according to your expectations. Sometimes God condescends to the way we do things that are morally neutral things, and accommodates that. And other times he puts his stamp down in such a way that says, no, we're doing it this way. Think about the king that God wanted to have over Israel. God let Israel have Saul. They wanted a king early. If they just waited a few more decades, they would have had God's choice. He let them have Saul so they could see the effects of having their own way. And then it's time, for the real choice, the one after God's own heart, to be chosen. And Jesse trots out his boys. How many? How many boys? 5 boys. And he's the youngest, the smallest. And that's God's choice. That's got the fingerprints of God all over it. And so we need to let God do what he wants to do and not what we think he ought to do. It's a great, profound lesson in life. There's one last part to this section, verses 21 to 22, where Jacob is going to give a special blessing directly to his son Joseph. Verse 21, Then Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you. And you won't notice this in English, but in the Hebrew text, God will be with y'all. It's plural. And bring you back to the land of your fathers. I give you, singular, one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Maybe you have a different Bible on the desk in front of you. I'm using the New American Standard. They've translated it, I will give you one portion more. This is a hard phrase to translate. The word is literally, I will give you Shechem one. Shechem. Remember that place? There's a city named Shechem. Now, Shechem is a common word. It's a body part word. It means shoulder. Why would you name a city shoulder? Because it's up on a ridge. So the word Shechem came to mean a mountain ridge. It could mean a shoulder. How many shoulders do you have? You have to have two. So these are like shares of things. So sometimes it means a portion. There's one portion, another portion. So it's the name of a city. It's a word for a mountain ridge. It's also a word for a portion. So which one is it? It is fascinating that when Joseph's body is taken out of Egypt with the sons of Israel 400 years later, when it's brought to the promised land, where do they bury him? They bury him at Shechem. Jacob had bought land at Shechem. His family had fought battles at Shechem. It was an awful battle. They shouldn't have gotten into it at all. But the result was they ended up having land. And I think that's to what Jacob is referring. That land that was full of bad memory, I'm going to give that to you. It'll be reclaimed and redeemed. Your descendants can live there, and it turns out that's the place the book of Joshua tells us. Joshua 24:32, where the bones of Joseph were buried. So the son who's in charge receives a special blessing, a blessing extended down to his sons. That will bring us the next time we're together into chapter 49, where Jacob is going to prophesy over his other sons. And one of the most important parts of the book of Genesis is chapter 49. Might be surprised. There are some extremely profound prophecies about Messiah in chapter 49. So when it's my turn in the pulpit on Sunday mornings in the new year, we'll be focusing on a few of those choice ones, and then we'll survey the others as well. As he goes through his boys one by one, a friend of mine has written a book on this. He's called it Jacob's Dozen. As he goes through the blessings one by one, we'll see some very rich things in the days ahead as God's promised plan continues to march forward. Would you join me, please, in prayer? Lord in heaven, we thank you for the time of Bible study that we've had tonight to look at this an unusual portion with twists and turns we wouldn't expect, and some things hard to understand and other things simple. But the profound truth that overgirds it all is that you were performing your perfect plan, bringing about things that no one could have imagined, setting up people to lead so that the promised seed that you had ordained in ages past would come about. Lord, we now live thousands of years later, and we connect with this story because of an offspring of Abraham's family, an offspring of the tribe of Judah, Jesus the Messiah, who is bringing to fulfillment all the richness promised to Abraham of ages ago. He's already begun it. We're living in that blessing now, and there's much more to come when he comes again. So, Lord, cause us to be engaged in the promised plan that you've begun. Daily may it be the thing that dominates our life. In Christ's name we ask it all. Amen.